So I want to offer a brief segue here before we dive into the details. Feel free to fast forward through this, but just to really emphasize, because I don't want to understate the importance of polyprotic systems, because they really are all systems. There's not actually that many monoprotic weak acids out there. Most of them contain multiple, at least di, if not triprotic. So these are all the pKa's of the amino acids. And you can see that all of them have at least one carboxylate pKa and ammonium pKa, so they have two, and many of them have these additional R groups or substituents that have a third system. This is massively important, right? Because understanding actually how, or speciation of any of these particular amino acids, it tells us what the form of that molecule is in biological pHs. This is massively important for how things move into and outside of cells and through different membranes inside cells. It's also massively important for how things like drugs move through the blood-brain barrier. So we often have polyprotic systems. So do you want your drug, if you're manufacturing this, right, and you're a synthetic chemist, and you're working for Pfizer, or are you trying to get a drug that passes through the blood-brain barrier? And if you are, then what specific form do you want? Do you need it to be negatively charged, positively charged, neutral? Do you need it to be zwitterionic, meaning it has both a positive and a negative charge on it simultaneously, meaning you've protonated the base, but you've deprotonated the carboxylate? These are crucial questions to think about how a molecule moves through space and time. These are biological relevance, but I think I want to tell you quickly about an environmental relevance to polyprotic systems that's really important. The polyprotic acid that I want to talk about is immensely important. I think I alluded to this in a previous, I don't remember which video, but some video. I talked a little bit about carbonic acid, but now's the time to really frame it because it's a polyprotic acid. So it's a diprotic, it's H2CO3. It's important to all of us because it's one of the main culprits, or at least one of the main species in interplay with CO2 in terms of ocean acidification and the damage that it does to our marine life, not to mention the dilution of oceans simply from polar ice cap melting. So how do you get there? What's H2CO3 and what's its relevance? Well, I drew this really amazing cartoon here. So you get CO2 in the atmosphere, and that's anthropogenic in source. So that means we as humans produce that either through emissions via combustion reactions of hydrocarbons in our cars. That's a huge contributor, but also industry. So cruise ships are massive, huge contributions to CO2 to the environment, but also industry and our manufacturing processes both here and abroad. So we produce a bunch of this stuff. It goes up into the atmosphere and then gets stuck in the atmosphere, and essentially then you have this little petri dish where all of the CO2 is residing above giant beakers of water, which are our oceans and our natural waters. So of course Henry's law is going to say that, well, the concentration that gets dissolved as an aqueous form of CO2 is going to be a function of whatever that equilibrium constant is, Kh, which is fairly high for CO2, and it's directly proportional. So the more CO2, as this concentration increases, then of course the concentration of CO2 dissolved in water, in our oceans, in our lakes, in our streams, it also goes up. So we get more CO2 that's dissolved. Well, what does that? Well, that aqueous CO2, that dissolved CO2, then can react with the water directly in whatever those water media are, whether they're oceans or lakes or streams or whatever, and then it continues to react with carbonate in solution. So carbonate's the CO3 minus, and so there's an equilibrium concentration of carbonate in all aqueous systems on Earth. And so what it does is CO2 reacts with that to create this species bicarbonate, HCO3. Seems innocuous, right? What that does is every time 1 mole of CO2 reacts with CO3 it sucks that CO3 out of the system, decreasing that concentration of CO3 Well, why is that relevant and why is it important? Well, marine life are highly dependent on carbonate ion because it is the core of most of their structure. It's what they make themselves out of. So if we look at this, that's actually this equilibrium solubility, calcium carbonate. This is what marine life are made of, including coral, plankton, and other species, but also non-living species, things like rocks, limestone, dolomite. They're all made of carbonate. So what happens is if you go and you dissolve CO2, if you generate a bunch of CO2 in your car, that increases the equilibrium concentration in the air, that puts more partial pressure of CO2 down on the surface of the Earth, which drives that CO2 to dissolve as an aqueous form of CO2. The more aqueous CO2 that we have, that scoops up and eats up lots of carbonate, turns it into bicarbonate. When it scoops up that carbonate and reacts with it, that decreases the equilibrium concentration of carbonate. If it decreases the equilibrium concentration of carbonate, that starts to go down. What happens to the equilibrium governed by KSP for calcium carbonate? Well, it's going to shift this way massively to create more carbonate. In doing so, it dissolves calcium carbonate, which is what coral and plankton and rocks and all of those things are made of. This is the fundamental relationship in terms of the aqueous equilibria that give rise to ocean acidification. And really, ocean acidification, this is ocean acidification. The reason we call it ocean acidification is because it's generating protonated species of carbonate, which means you have more H plus in the solution, more H2CO3 in the solution. Because if you have HCO3, I should just say as an aside, then of course that's in equilibrium with H2CO3. So if you have carbonate in equilibrium with all three of these things, you increase this concentration, it just becomes more acidic. So this is what ocean acidification is, and this is the consequence, because it's really related to these three sets of equilibria. You have CO2, a gas in equilibrium with its dissolved state, simply a linear function of how much of that partial pressure we have in the atmosphere. Then we have CO2 in equilibrium with bicarbonate through the reaction of carbonate. So if you decrease that concentration of carbonate, you simultaneously decrease the concentration of carbonate in this equilibrium because they're the same carbonate. That shoves the equilibrium to the right, which dissolves our calcium carbonate, and now we have lots of calcium dissolved in the solution, in the system. With these projections, so geochemists and environmental chemists alike have sort of teamed up and looked at these systems based on the treatment of multiple equilibria. So this is a systematic treatment of equilibrium problem where you have lots of equilibrium that are intersecting. If we project this, the projections are dire. They're saying that we've got, roughly 100 years before the concentrations of carbonate are low enough that we destroy sort of irreversibly a lot of the life that's formed from calcium carbonate. And so you can get a really general sense that what is your impact on marine life? Every time you put CO2 into the air, that's what's happening. And I'm not trying to guilt you. I'm just giving you a sense for the tangible effects, the literal effects of anthropogenic sources of CO2 through combustion. So I think this is a really nice example. We'll probably talk about this, I don't know, either in a quiz or an exam. I like to use this example just because it's a nice one, but I also like it as a framing perspective. So all things are polyprotic, and they're all important, either biologically or environmentally or geochemically or whatever.